All right, looks like we're going live. Awesome. Well, hi everybody on Facebook. I'm coming to you from Zoom. I'm Nirupam from the Underwater Photography Guide and Bluewater Photo. Today I thought I'd give just a short presentation that I gave at Scuba Show a few months ago, kind of talking about my experience using newer camera technology on one of our underwater photo workshops in Raja Ampat. I had the opportunity to use some of the latest camera equipment like the Sony A7R5, as well as the latest in editing programs like Adobe Lightroom. So all of this is kind of combined to reflect a new trend in photography in general, which, as you probably have heard, is artificial intelligence. So I'll get into how artificial intelligence kind of has affected underwater photography, how it's affecting our equipment, and how it's also affecting post-processing after that, as well as just what it's like to dive in Raja Ampat, because I think that deserves a little bit of time too. If you have any questions at all, make sure you drop them in the comments and I'll try to respond to them. And I'll check those comments every now and then, or you can just interrupt me on Zoom. So yeah, thanks, Mike, for coming. And with that, I'm gonna share a presentation. I'll share Lightroom, little video. So it's kind of a multimedia presentation. It also requires a lot of processing for my computer to live stream this and to show you guys AI softwares. So there is the potential for a crash or things to go wrong. And if so, I'll just open Zoom and connect again. But that's always a possibility. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Let's see. All right. And Mike, are you able to see this? Okay, great. Yeah, so hopefully we're on a full screen view of the presentation. But here is a photo I took in Raja Ampat of some amazing clownfish that were in a anemone and living in their home. As you can see, everything is pretty tack sharp. And I was using Sony's new autofocus system, which is based on artificial intelligence, but I'll get into that and what that means for underwater photography. So this is, again, a presentation from Scuba Show. So if you didn't know already, we lead photo workshops for Bluewater Photo and Travel and the Underwater Photography Guide. So what is Bluewater Photo and Travel? We're the world's #1 dive travel agency. We do personal trip bookings, guided workshops, guided trips, and safaris. So our guided photo workshops, we actually go with people on site, teach them underwater photography, underwater videography, as you can see here. And yeah, it's a whole lot of fun. Now, the Underwater Photography Guide is kind of our media arm. So we really try to educate people on the Underwater Photography Guide and Bluewater University, which this video is hosted at. We try to give tutorials, equipment reviews to talk about the latest photography equipment. That's part of why I'm doing this presentation. I really think it's a good idea to kind of get everybody up to speed where the technology is at and where it's headed, so people can kind of make decisions in the future about their photography. And finally, we have Bluewater Photo, which is where we sell underwater photo and video equipment. So any of the stuff I'm talking about, you know where to get it. And yeah, that's basically what we do. So let's talk a little bit about Raja Ampat. Raja Ampat's a pretty spectacular place. It's often known as one of the best dive destinations in the world. The reason for that is the unparalleled biodiversity. So you can see that the landscape is very rugged, it's very beautiful, and there's a lot of little tiny islands and knobs kind of coming out from the sea, and you have all these channels splitting up all these land masses. So it's these channels and the changing in sea level that actually causes a lot of this diversity, because you have little microclimates underwater between each section of the area. So it really helps create biodiversity and to spread it out to the rest of the Pacific. So you can kind of see this is the coral triangle. So this is the center of marine global biodiversity. The species get created here. It's like a laboratory. It's kind of like the Galapagos, if you've ever heard of the Galapagos being called a living laboratory. Raja Ampat and the Coral Triangle is the same way. So speciation occurs here, and it starts to branch out across the Pacific and Indian Oceans from Raja Ampat. So you see a lot of the same species across the Pacific, but you see less variety than you would in Raja Ampat. I like to say that, and I think Mark Hatter, one of our trip leaders, told me this, but you see a lot of one species in other places. In Raja Ampat, you see a lot of species, but only maybe one or two individuals of each one. So it's kind of interesting how you see such biodiversity, but it's not necessarily abundance of each species, although there are many species that are abundance, and there's a lot of abundance. So this is where Raja Ampat is. It's kind of in the center of Indonesia, in West Papua. So Raja Ampat means 4 kings, and folklore basically tells us of a woman who found 7 eggs. 4 of the eggs hatched, and those became the kings of the 4 largest islands in that part of Indonesia. The other 3 are a ghost, a woman, and a stone. I haven't seen the other 3 while I was diving there, but that's the way the legend goes. Now, Raja Ampat is in the tropics. It has a tropical rainforest ecoregion. It's home to many endemic species itself above water, including 2 birds of paradise. But as I said before, it's the center of marine global biodiversity. It's home to 600 species of hard coral, 1,700 species of reef fish. So it's the perfect place to test any modern camera equipment. Now, this is kind of an interesting look at Indonesia and this part of the Coral Triangle. So there's this line here called the Wallace Line. And the Wallace Line actually separates Australia from Asia. And as sea levels changed going up and down, Australia was accessible or inaccessible to different animals. So that's why you have marsupials in Australia and mammals in the rest of Asia. So underwater, the Wallace Line kind of holds true. You have your more Pacific species, and then on the west side, you have your more Indian Ocean species. So during glacial periods, ocean sea levels were 390 feet lower. The shelves were connected as a landmass, and that rise and lowering in sea level that happens on a cycle over time, that's really what's contributing to a lot of the speciation and biodiversity. So during our trip, this was our vessel for the voyage. It's a really, really amazing vessel. It's a traditional Indonesian panisi. So a lot of liveaboards in Indonesia are built out of this teak wood. The vessel was actually built by one of the crew members, so I thought that was pretty cool. And it was a Bluewater travel workshop, so I got to teach a lot about underwater photography while I was on board. They had a TV in the back for teaching, and the front was all the dive deck and a few pangas for us to go to the site in. So it was really fun to be in a fully wooden boat, and it was a really beautiful experience. So let's talk a little bit about Raja Ampat. Raja Ampat actually has quite a bit of diversity in the diving itself. There's kind of different ecosystems that you're exploring. My favorite is Mizul on the bottom here. Now, Mizul is soft coral central. There's tons of colors, tons of schools of fish. There can be manta rays, but really what makes Mizul special is that you have these fast currents that contribute to a lot of soft corals. That's very pretty to capture on a camera. It also really pushes your camera to the limits because you are going at really fast speeds. So your camera should have good stabilization systems, and it should be able to have good autofocus so that you can capture reef scenes as you're floating by really quickly. We spent some time in Batanta, a little bit longer than usual, just due to weather. So Batanta is a really cool place because it has a lot of manta rays, but also great muck diving. Now, I've done some amazing muck diving in Anilao. There's some great muck diving in Lembe, but I say Batanta actually rivals a lot of these places. And in just 2 days of diving there, I saw most of what I've seen in Anilao. So I thought that was really, really cool. The Fam Islands are also really interesting. They're kind of a rocky coral reef. So it's very different from Mizul in that the reefs are just as amazing, but they're all rocky, stony corals. So you can see different kinds of life, different kinds of reef fish in those ecosystems. And that's more like a traditional coral reef but it's some of the best coral reef diving I've seen, particularly a place called Melissa's Garden. So we spent a few dives there, and that was really amazing. And finally, there's Dampier Strait, which is known for sweet lips and fast currents that go along more rocky reefs. There's also some good muck diving there as well. So this was our group after some dives, and we got to go up to a lookout that really shows you what creates that biodiversity. It's all these little channels with fast moving current in rock structure that splits those channels up into reefs, usually walls. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the photos I captured there and how the camera performed while I was shooting underwater. And hopefully that kind of will be a nice bridge into camera technology in general and how we can use some of this advanced camera tech to capture places like Raja Ampat. So on the right, you can see that the eye of this anemone fish is pretty crisp, and that the camera was able to capture the anemone fish versus the diver in the background, which is actually a little bit softer in focus. So one of the things I was testing was to see when you set it into animal eye autofocus, will it capture animal eyes? And it does a pretty good job, especially if you're doing close focus, wide angle, or macro. But for wide angle scenes, I'd say cameras have yet to get to that point where they're able to automatically identify an animal and see the eye. But it does work in some macro situations, which I'll show coming up. On the left side, I think my in-body image stabilization system really helped. I'll talk a little bit more about this as well. But basically, my sensor was on a gyroscope, and it was moving around as I was moving, which actually reduces motion blur when you're taking photos. In this case, I had to use a really low shutter speed because it was a dark day, and I was still able to get crisp jacks in the photo. Another example of how you can shoot at really low shutter speeds and still get really crisp photos. Having the strobes also helps freeze the frame and freeze all the subjects in there. But this is a famous school of fish that's in Missoula. It's at a site called Four Kings, I believe, actually, which was my favorite site of the trip. And there's a lot of very pretty soft corals there. We'll talk a little bit more about this sea turtle photo in a second. I'm going to show you how I used a sharpening program to actually get that face in focus, because this sea turtle was not in focus when I took the photo. Now you can actually use softwares that are based on AI that can allow you to sharpen up photos just by using the software. So a lot of photos that you might have thrown away before because they're out of focus or because there's motion blur, you can now recover them. This just shows the amazing colors and diversity all at once. You can see all these different invertebrates and at the same time all these different types of fish. My camera did a really good job capturing this nudibranch and making sure that the rhinophores were in focus. I actually have a video that I'm going to show you guys on how cameras can now use autofocus tracking systems where you press your AF on button on the back of the camera and the autofocus box will actually lock onto the area where you want to shoot. So even though this isn't a traditional subject with an eye, I was able to get the Sony A7R5 to actually lock on to the rhinophore, and even though I was moving my camera to recompose, it was able to keep composing and keep focusing on that focus point. This photo was taken with a Merlux soft snoot. I'll talk a little bit about snoot photography because that's also kind of something where the technology has been really moving forward. And in this case, I was able to use an aiming light to capture the shrimp that was inside of a tunic. I just really like this composition. It was really fun matching colors in the gorgonians versus the fish itself. I always try to look for places where the fish kind of match the patterns of the substrate as well and capture them both in the environment to show perspective. This again is a good example of where an autofocus tracking system can work really well. And I actually missed focus just a little bit on this photo as well and ended up using a sharpening tool called Topaz AI to actually sharpen up this photo as well. And I'll show you guys that in a bit. Just another example of just how many fish and how abundance can be there, even if it's mostly biodiversity. More schools of fish in the rocky reefs. and let's talk about the camera tech behind it. Now, before I do this, I'm going to go ahead and check Facebook to see if we have any comments or questions. So just give me one quick second. Okay, no comments just yet. So let's get back to the presentation. Oh. Here we go. Okay. All right, so the Sony a7R5. Now, for those of you that haven't really been keeping up with camera technology lately, the Sony a7R5 is Sony's newest full-frame mirrorless camera. It's a 61 megapixel mirrorless camera, so it has the highest resolution full-frame sensor in the world. So it is kind of a higher-end Sony camera, but it's not Sony's highest-end camera. So Sony's top-of-the-line camera is called the Sony A1. What makes the Sony a7R5 different is that they made a body that was more suited to taking high-resolution photographs than the A1. It's also actually a little bit less expensive than the A1 as well. Now, the way this A7R5 is different from the A1 is that with advancements in artificial intelligence, Sony's been able to actually transform that into hardware solutions that they packed into the body. So the Sony a7R5 has hardware technology that uses AI to make the autofocus systems better, to make the white balance more accurate, and to just overall make systems on the camera function a lot better than they would have in the past. So let's talk a little bit about this and what AI really is. So if we look at this camera, I was able to take this for the first time diving in Raja Ampat. It was right when the camera came out, and as I mentioned, it has a 61 megapixel full frame sensor. It has real-time autofocus tracking with a dedicated AI autofocus processor. So this processor is dedicated to using AI, basically using a lot of data, and I'll talk a little bit about more how that works. But it uses a lot of data to train the camera to find subjects and track them with its autofocus. Another thing that this camera can do is it moves the sensor on a gyroscope. Now, this is called in-body image stabilization, but when you remove mirrors from a camera and you don't have a mirror inside the camera, there's a lot of space inside of this mirrorless camera for that sensor to move around as you move the camera itself. So this allows you to shoot at lower shutter speeds without getting motion blur in your subject. And that's because the camera is actually compensating for your movement. Another thing that was capable with the a7R5 was 8K video. Processing has also gotten a lot better lately in mirrorless technology, and it can also do 4K video up to 60 frames per second. And then 10 frames per second burst shooting. Now, 10 frames per second doesn't necessarily sound super fast, especially compared to a lot of cameras these days, like the Sony A1 that can shoot up to 30 frames per second. But what makes this really impressive is that the Sony a7R5 is a 61 megapixel camera. So all that data is going through at 10 frames per second, and that's really impressive considering that each file is 130 megabytes. So in about a week of shooting, I actually fill up almost a terabyte of information. Okay, so let's get into AI and what is AI and how can you use AI to improve camera systems? So AI is technology that mimics human intelligence by inferring and synthesizing information based on experience. So it basically uses information to create better results. So that is a process called machine learning. So machine learning is a learning algorithm that can improve a computer's performance based on a set of training data. So in this case, we've been photographers a long time. I think people have been doing digital photography for a few decades now. And what that's resulted in is millions and millions and millions of images out there on the internet, on different databases, on stock websites, and all these different places. And if you use the right algorithm, you can actually get computers to learn what does a good image look like. So you might have seen this in more interesting applications. I'm not going to go into those applications in detail, but there's an application called Midjourney and a lot of different artificial photo generators where you can actually type in a bunch of words, any series of words that you want. Let's say a rushing nesting doll underwater in a shark's mouth. And it will create an image based on this database that it has that gives it images of sharks, or it gives it images of underwater environments. And it does a pretty good job. So that's kind of where we're headed with machine learning, and it brings into question really what is photography and what should photography be in the future, because what's the point? In some cases, we don't even need to go out and take photos. Those photos have been taken in different ways, and we can just manipulate machine learning algorithms to create those photos. But we're not quite there yet. What we're kind of in is this hybrid role where we can use computer programs to improve our photography, and that's the goal right now. So how does machine learning and AI apply to photography? As I said before, the internet has allowed us to create massive amounts of data, and that data can train cameras and editing softwares to improve photos. So for instance, Sony has this new AI processor unit. This processor unit uses a large data set that has been given to it by Sony to improve subject recognition. So that camera can actually go in and say, based on all these photos of fish that I have, this is a fish. And once it recognizes that fish, it can use its tracking system to follow it around. So that's improved subject recognition by about 40% just by having this dedicated processor. The processor also helps with white balance. So it takes a bunch of images, looks at the white balance and says, all right, what white balance should I choose for this situation? And that also has done a good job. And I found that in many ways, my video has improved because auto white balance is also very good on this camera. So here's an example. I was taking a photo of a ladybug amphipod. Now, if you haven't seen one of these before, they're very tiny. They're just a speck in the water. I mean, in most cases, I wouldn't even attempt to photograph one. In this case, I had a 90mm macro lens, and on top of that, I had a +13 diopter that I would put on top of the lens. So when I went to go focus on this subject, the amphipod was actually inside of a tunicate at night without an ability to get a light shined on the amphipod. So how does a camera recognize that there's a subject within this structure? Well, the camera's been trained on many photos to recognize, okay, this center of the tunicate is an area, and there's this weird subject right in the middle. So even though most cameras would really struggle in this situation where you have a 3D tunicate, you don't have a focus light shined on the amphipod, this shot was taken in the first frame. So to me, that's really incredible. It usually takes me 20, 30, 40 photos to get a photo of a ladybug amphipod. In this case, I did it in just one frame, and the camera was spot on. So I still like to say it's not the camera, it's the photographer, but in this case, it was the camera. And I think that's just really interesting. Oh, sorry, one quick second. Okay, so, that brings us to the next slide, which is a demonstration in AI applications. So as I mentioned before, you can use AI in not only the camera, but also the processing. And I think that's where it really starts to show, just how this technology is changing. If you guys haven't downloaded the most recent version of Lightroom Classic, I highly recommend you do that now. It's worth getting Lightroom, even though you're on a subscription model. Lightroom has gotten light years and light years ahead of its time, to the point where now Lightroom is actually able to detect subjects as well, and you can edit specific subjects. So I'll show you guys how that works. And I'll also show you how other softwares, Lightroom included, can actually improve noise reduction and sharpening very extensively, past the point you could have ever done in the softwares before. So let's get into that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll move into Lightroom. And before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and check to see if there's any questions on Facebook. None at all right now.
Hey, Neerpam,
Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, can you just talk a little bit? So is Sony leading the way right now with AI? I mean, how about Nikon and Canon? Do they have similar types of Canon or cameras?
Yeah. So both Canon and Nikon do have machine learning based algorithms in their cameras. I'd say Sony is leading that charge, especially because it has new processors and new hardware that they're adding to a lot of these cameras. Now, it doesn't usually happen like that for long. So Sony is always the one to kind of introduce new technology, and then Canon usually perfects it. I'll be honest in saying that Nikon is now usually about 3 or 4 years behind.
Okay.
But I would say between Sony and Canon, it's always a toss-up because once Canon perfects it, it takes another year or two for Sony to do a better job.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But yeah, that's a really great question. So, all right. So let's get into the demonstration. I will go ahead and share my screen. Oh, okay. Are you able to see Lightroom?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so starting with the most impressive feature, because I always think it's fun to start with the most impressive thing, I will show you guys that turtle photo that I talked about earlier and how you can use AI sharpening programs to actually improve sharpness on this turtle. So let me go ahead and find it. There we go. Now, the turtle itself was actually in pretty good focus before. It wasn't in perfect focus, though. And it's kind of, AI hasn't got to the point where something completely out of focus will be completely in focus, but it'll really improve a photo. So this is the sharpened photo, but I'm going to go ahead and go back and take the original. Okay, so the original photo is this photo right here. Now, if we take a look at it, the sharpness of the photo itself does look pretty decent. But what I can go ahead and do is edit this in Topaz Sharpen AI. And it'll pull up this program that I recommend. And I've added this program as a plugin to Lightroom. So Topaz Sharpen AI is available in different forms for about $60 per program. I think it's very much worth getting because it's better than just getting a whole new lens. It will redefine all your previous photos and make you want to edit everything all over again. So this, now I'm going to go ahead and update a preview, and it's choosing an algorithm to sharpen this photo. And it's going to take a little bit of time to process. It always does. But here's my preview now. And you can see the difference in detail is just pretty phenomenal. Especially when you have a big screen. So as I said before, it's really great for photos that where the focus is there, but it's not perfect. It does an amazing job of just sharpening those up and making those look better. And I can also run through a couple more examples of that because it doesn't just do it with subjects, it can do it with substrate as well. So if I go back to some of my top shots from this trip. Oh, here we go. I think this ladybug amphipod also really showed up well. So I'll go ahead and go to that photo. Okay. So if we take a look at this amphipod, it's in pretty good focus, but because this is such a small subject, there's a little bit of diffraction. So it's not 100% when it comes to the details. So if I go ahead and go to Topaz Sharpen AI, and I open it there, and again, this is pretty taxing on a computer, so it does take a second. I do recommend having high RAM and also processing on your CPU. So if I update the algorithm, it's going to take a second to update. Now it's updated it, and again, it's subtle, but it does a really good job of just adding just enough detail. Now, one of the things that I noticed about this photo was that in the original photo, the autofocus point was just slightly behind the head of the amphipod. But when I add that sharpening, now the head and the details in front of the amphipod are just a bit better, and it makes it a little bit more three-dimensional. So again, this is a very subtle effect, but it's very useful. And there's also softwares that can do noise reduction as well. Adobe's actually just announced a noise reduction software that I haven't really played around with or compared to Topaz, but I'm hoping that eventually they'll be able to also announce a sharpening software. So if we go back to these photos, now I can show you guys what Adobe can do, because I think in a lot of ways, Lightroom's been even more impactful using AI technology to find subjects and allow you to edit them. Again, when the way Topaz Sharpen works is that it takes all these photos of, it takes a database of photos and it tells the software, okay, this is what an in-focus photo should look like. Well, Adobe is a lot more interesting because it'll allow you to select different subjects in different places to edit. So let's take a look at a subject that I might want to edit. Oh, here's a good example. So here is a very difficult to edit subject. This is a mantis shrimp. And I didn't do a good job of the original photo, I'll be honest. So if I take a look at the original, my original shot was over here. And if I go ahead and go to the editing software, you can see that overall, it didn't come out super well. Now, what Lightroom can do is it can actually allow me to choose areas of this image that I can select. Now, probably the most useful tool is actually called the object tool. And that allows you to select an area and it'll say, okay, this object, this area has a subject in it, and this is the subject, allowing you to edit separate from the subject itself. So I'll go ahead and add a mask, and then I can select objects. Now, what Lightroom allows me to do is it allows me to highlight the area where my subject is. And I don't remember if I tried this out in my last presentation on this subject, but hopefully it works. And now it's selected the mantis shrimp. And again, this is kind of a hard substrate to do it on, but I think it did a pretty decent job. So I can actually invert my subject now, and now I can add a black background. Now you can see there's different areas where it missed. So this isn't the best subject for that. So maybe what I'll want to do instead is select the subject itself. And it actually did a better job in this case of finding the subject of this photo so that now I can edit it separate from everything else. So now I can go ahead and try to add this black background. Maybe darken the blacks just a tad. And I'm not going to go through the whole process of editing the photo, but you can see I can kind of create a snoot effect just by selecting the subject using Lightroom. So you can see that's kind of the end result. Now, if I went ahead and went to, let's say, a reefscape, because I think the reefscapes are also very interesting when you're trying to edit a reefscape. So let's go back to these photos here. Okay, so if I look at a reefscape, let's see, I think, well, this is a pretty busy photo. It might trip up Lightroom a little bit, but I am curious. So what I often use Lightroom for is I like to try to edit the background differently from the foreground. So if I select the background, the background selection is a little bit more useful when you have a main subject. I think it feels that the subject is the fish in this case. Another thing I like to do is I like to select the sky, because Lightroom does a pretty good job of finding, okay, where is the sky, or in this case, the water above a wide angle substrate. Now I can edit the sky separate from the rest of the photo. So let me find a photo that's a little bit less busy and that's a little bit easier to edit. Usually having a diver kind of helps. This is a good one. Okay, so here's the original photo, or one of them in the frame. And what I can do is I can actually now select, I think, now I can select my sky. And it does a pretty good job of selecting the water. So if I want, I can make the water deeper. I can make it more saturated. I can do whatever I want to this scene to really split up the scene and edit different parts of the frame in different ways. So another thing that I might want to do is edit this diver. So I can just select the diver using the object tool. And now it's selected the diver. I can add a bit of contrast and make him more of a silhouette. Or I can go ahead and see what the subject is. Maybe it'll select the coral as the subject, which I'm hoping for. And it didn't do a great job with the subject. Sometimes complicated substrates are a little bit harder to select, but then I just use the object tool and I tell Lightroom, okay, there is a subject within my boundary. And I'll probably do a separate presentation on how to really use these tools and make them powerful. But what I want to show is that Lightroom has been trained with data from a lot of different photos to select different objects in your image and edit them separately. So now I can edit this coral separately, and maybe add a little bit of clarity and a little bit of saturation. So it really gives you a whole lot of power when you're editing, because you can split up different elements in your photo. So that is Lightroom and Topaz Sharpen AI when it comes to using these AI tools for editing. Another thing that I can show you is how the autofocus system in the Sony A1 in this case actually tracks subjects. So I have a short clip that I have on YouTube that really goes into showing how the camera works inside. So what I did is I used a Atomos Ninja 5. I connected it to the Sony A1 while I was shooting underwater. And here in a few seconds, you can see how does the camera actually find the subject, select it, and track it. So you can see how it performs in this clip. So you can see here, this is just a normal focus mode. The camera does a really good job at acquiring quickly. And then when I switch to tracking, you can see on a nudibranch, the tracking box can basically follow the subject so that you get the image. And that is what we're looking for in a camera, because it really allows you to focus on composition. Now, this is with the Sony A1. The Sony A7R5 is about 40% better at doing this because it has that separate AI autofocus processor. Unfortunately, I didn't bring a Ninja 5 to Raja Ampat, so I can't really show you exactly how it works in the A7R5, but I can tell you that the difference is noticeable. So that's my quick demonstration. I'll go ahead and check Facebook one more time before going back to our presentation. So, okay. Okay, so here we go. Mike, are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. All right, so that's our demonstration of AI. I'm going to kind of trail this presentation off and wrap it up with just a few more talking points about new technologies that are entering the market and how we use this in Raja Ampat to really film and photograph all of this amazing biodiversity that we saw. So one of the systems that I talked about briefly is in-body image stabilization. Most mirrorless cameras are equipped with this now, and basically what it is a gyroscope that's holding your sensor and compensating for your movement when you're taking photos. Now, the performance of these systems are often defined by stops of correction. So what that means is if you're taking a photo, you can take images with an in-body image stabilization system in situations that are a certain number of stops darker without getting motion blur. So if I was in a dark area and I took a photo, I could, if I turn on in-body image stabilization, I can shoot with a shutter speed 8 stops lower than I normally would be without the system. So it's a pretty amazing system, and it allows you to take photos of subjects that aren't moving, like this coral, in really low shutter speed. So this was 1/80th of a second. I pushed it all the way down to 1/8 of a second on a lot of modern cameras. I think the best camera out there right now is actually not the A7R5, even though I think it does have up to 8 stops of correction, but the Canon R5 does a really good job with it. This is an example where motion blur can kind of help your photography. So in this photo, I was actually at 1/8 of a second, and I used the flash to kind of freeze the subject in the center. Now, all of these cameras are also getting faster and better processors. Like I said, that allows you to shoot at faster burst rates without having a buffer. It also allows you to use autofocus systems like this and a lot of the systems that are available on the camera. And finally, we're kind of getting to this point where sensors are so quick and processors are so quick at taking that data that we actually no longer need a mechanical shutter. And in many cases, cameras are coming out where they're able to take a photo completely with electronic shutters, and cameras like the Nikon Z8, the Nikon Z9, and the Canon R3 no longer have a mechanical shutter at all. So you're actually in silent mode the whole time, just using the sensor to take a photo. And that allows you to get sharper images because you don't have vibration in the camera itself when it takes a photo, but it also allows you to shoot at faster shutter speeds and doesn't put any wear on the camera. So the cameras last longer now. Dual base ISO. This is also an interesting technology that's really shown up, and it shows up with the Sony A7R5. So a lot of cameras, especially Sony cameras, are being built with different well sizes on their photo sites on the sensor. Now that sounds really technical, but what that means is when you have different amounts of photons hitting the photo sites on the sensor, it can choose how wide is that photo site going to be. Is it going to bring in a lot of photons, or is it going to bring in a little bit of photons? And that allows the camera to basically have 2 base ISOs where the noise is at its lowest level. So as you increase your ISO, noise increases. Well, with Sony cameras, for instance, there's actually one ISO, let's call it ISO 100, which is your base ISO, where the noise is the lowest. The noise will increase until it hits a second base ISO where the noise drops back down again. So it's really good to know what your second base ISO is so that you can be there and not shoot at the ISO right below that where you'll actually have higher noise. So in the Sony A7R5, it's not that impressive. The second base is at 320, but cameras like the Sony A7S III can have a second base at 1600. So that allows modern cameras to do really well in low light, especially with video. And that's really where it comes into play. With the Sony A7R5, the video specs, but also in other Sony cameras, are really nice, and their cameras are becoming a little bit more video oriented. So you want to be able to increase your ISO, because when it comes to underwater video, you're shooting at higher ISOs than you would with photography. So like that kind of segues me into this next slide, where video is the future of photography. So the A7R5 is capable of filming at 8K video. Now, most screens don't have 8K. So why would you film 8K video? Well, in a lot of cases, you can take that 8K video and crop and export your video in 4K. That allows you to get a lot closer to macro subjects and to have new perspectives on wide angle video that you're filming. So that's really useful, as well as 4K. Now 4K has become the standard with a lot of screens, and 4K 60 or anything higher than 30 is ideal for underwater video, because you really want those higher frame rates to be able to slow your footage down in post-processing and make your video more stable. Your video underwater is in a 3-dimensional environment. There's a lot of shake, there's a lot of movement. If you can export a video in 24 frames per second, but film it in 60 or film it in 120, as a lot of cameras can do now, you can really stabilize your footage. And I've been doing that a lot with my handheld video. Um, the A7R5 can also film in RAW, which is something that you couldn't do for a very long time, only in the highest end cinema cameras that might cost $100,000. But now a lot of cameras are actually coming out with RAW video, and it's becoming a standard, which gives you a lot of capability in post-processing, because you can edit video the same way you might edit a photo and really play around with the colors and the look and the feel of the video. Now, that takes a lot of expertise. I wouldn't recommend it for a novice video shooter, but that capability is there, along with logarithmic profiles that can kind of help you bring back details and edit white balance a little bit better. Another thing that I used while I was in Raja Ampat was TTL. Now, TTL is kind of the AI of underwater lighting. Now, it's not as high tech. It might get high tech at some point, but TTL is basically automatic strobe lighting. It's a feedback system between your cameras and your strobes. And I used electronic TTL, which is my favorite type of TTL. Now, that sounds complicated, but basically what it means is that there's an electronic connection from your camera to your strobes, where your camera tells your strobes what power to fire at. It works fairly well, and it works better in an electronic mode with sync cords than it would with fiber optic cables, because there's a little bit of, there's not 100% transmission when it comes to fiber optic cables. So I really felt like I was able to improve my photography with using TTL. However, it doesn't work very well when you're really close to subjects. So this photo that I took here was of a scorpion fish in Batanta. You can see it's a great place for muck diving. And in that case, I switched to manual in order to get the lighting right and to kind of reduce any hot exposures I might have got with TTL. I think this is an example of when TTL works really well, especially in blue water environments where you have pelagic fish and things going by. It does a really good job of lighting those up properly. And I really like how the shot came out. It's a little bit cropped. The original was not as cropped, but that's just the presentation. This is another great example of how TTL can really be used to light up your photos. The autofocus system worked great. I had an octopus and a grouper basically moving around, and it did a great job of capturing everything, and the white balance was awesome. Now, Sony has always had a problem with having good white balance, and up until now, it's been one of my less favorite camera brands because of that. But what's happened recently, especially with this AI processor, the AI processor is really improving white balance straight out of the camera. So your edits in Lightroom are really minimal. It does a great job of white balance now. And I actually saw that improvement in my photography and in my video when I was filming underwater. Another great example of the colors that can be created with the A7R5 and the autofocus system. And I also took this photo with TTL as well. And finally, I want to talk about snoots and how snoot photography has really progressed and how we use that in Raja Ampat. So one of the coolest items that has come to the market for underwater macro photographers is the Merlock Soft Pro. Now, this is a snoot that allows you to take light from your strobes, and it condenses it through optical lenses, allowing you to really concentrate that light on a subject, get nice high contrast black backgrounds, and beautiful lighting. Now, the way that the Soft is so unique is that it actually has a built-in aiming light and also a built-in aperture that allows you to change the width of the beam. So all you have to do is point your snoot at the subject, see it in the aiming light, change the width of the beam, and your photo will be exactly how the aiming light shows it. And the aiming light will actually turn off when you take the photo. The new Soft, the Soft Pro, actually comes with a red aiming light, so you don't scare away your subject, as well as an ecosystem of accessories for creative lighting. So I really enjoyed using the Pro when I was diving in Raja Ampat, and I just thought it really goes to show this is kind of my before picture of an anemone fish, and this is the same anemone fish and the same anemone with a snoot, so you can really concentrate and isolate that light. This is that mantis, the mantis shrimp photo that I was showing earlier. I think it also, I don't think the snoot really came out that great, but you know, with a little bit of post-processing, it really turned out into a phenomenal photo. This is another photo where I actually used the sharpening software to sharpen up the shrimp, which was a little bit out of focus, and I used the snoot as well to get that black background. So yeah, that's kind of the whole presentation. the last slide says it all. Let's go diving. So if you guys have any questions at all, I know that was perfect, about an hour. If you guys have any questions at all, make sure you drop them in the comments in Facebook. I'm happy to answer them. And with that, I will open up the floor to questions. So yeah, any questions?
Nearpalm. So when you're diving, Raja, is it pretty much like drift diving then?
Yeah, well, it's not entirely drift diving, but a lot of the best sites have drifts, and that's mostly in Missoula. So
Okay.
the Missoula's in the lower part of Raja. Um, it has a lot of walls and a lot of channels where you kind of drift through and you look at all the soft coral. But in the northern part of Raja, there's current, but you're usually kind of staying on the site. There's still a lot of sites that don't have drifts, like Batanta, great muck diving, not much drifting, pretty mild currents. It kind of changes with the tides. But I'd
Okay.
say Raja overall has more current and less visibility than other places because all those nutrients are being brought to the animals that live there.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Any challenges getting over there? Like
Oh,
luggage
yeah.
constraints or things like that, or?
I actually had a note to talk about that in my presentation. So Raja is a difficult place to travel to. It can take up to 4 days to get there. I highly recommend doing the full 4 days because it's important to have a full day layover in between flights. Mostly because you don't want, any bags to get lost or anything. Getting to Indonesia is not a direct flight from the US, so you have to fly. I flew through Japan, and then I stopped in Jakarta for a day. And then you fly from Jakarta to Sorong, and that's where all the liveaboards and kind of boats leave from. Now, what I recommend doing is flying on an airline called Garuda Airline. And the reason I recommend that is they allow you to bring up to 50 pounds of dive gear, as long as there's only dive gear in that bag, for free. So you can actually get an extra bag, and then you have plenty of space for camera equipment and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So it just takes patience. It's not really difficult to get there, but it's a good idea to have layovers. And for the most part, hotels in Indonesia are very nice too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But if you're ever wanting to know like the best route or what to do, definitely reach out to me or Jill. And yeah, we can kind of give you like, this is the best route to go on.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry. I'll keep asking questions if
Oh yeah,
it's
go
okay.
for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is for like AI then, like copywriting, is there anything out there as far as like in the camera itself that can stamp pictures or anything to try to copyright stuff more, or is that coming, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so you can copyright your photos in your metadata,
Right.
but when it comes to AI, what the general consensus is, and there might be a new court case, so there's always new court cases coming up.
Sure.
But if you use AI to create something, that ownership is yours. Now it gets a little bit hairy when you create something with the likeness that somebody else has done.
Right.
And that's where the lawsuits have really come in. I don't know what the status is on like creating, let's say, a photo that looks like Ansel Adams took it. But if you use AI to improve what you've already worked on, like these photos, those photos still belong to you. Now, when it comes to databases using your photos, I think in most cases you've had to have opted in some way. It might be in Google, it might be somewhere else. But usually they get you with that in the fine print. So
I mean, does it tweak the metadata in a way? It's like photo contests. Are they starting to watch that, or is there a way they can tell whether or not you've done AI versus not? Or
yeah, so we kind of ran into this issue when we had Ocean Art last year, and it was very clear to us that a good majority of the images had used Topaz to sharpen their photos.
okay.
I think photo contests are starting to realize that. A lot of photo contests have gone the route of, well, you know what, editing is free reign. You can do whatever you want. I think, that's a risky approach because it becomes more like an AI contest or a or an editing contest. But what we're thinking about doing in ocean art in the coming year is to allow Lightroom changes that are non-global. So that means using AI software to select your subjects and edit them different from other parts of the image. And then we'll probably also allow sharpening tools. So it won't be free reign, but I think now that it's become so integrated into how Lightroom is used, it's kind of necessary, and it's going with the times, allowing people to use AI. So
Interesting.
as you can see, there's a little bit of a difference between using an AI software or an AI chip in your camera than generative AI, where you're generating that image from the get-go.
Right.
So that's something that we definitely wouldn't allow.
Right.
Yeah.
One last question. So
Yeah.
as far as like using Topaz to sharpen your images, how does that, like, when do you do that in your workflow? Do you like do everything first and then do it, or do you do it at the beginning, or does that make sense? Or it varies?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I actually have to read up on how Topaz has changed in the last few months. What it used to be was you could only do it with the final product because it would export a TIFF and then it edits the TIFF and gives you a TIFF in return.
Okay.
So I used to do it as my last step, and then I would take out any additional backscatter because it actually makes backscatter worse because it's sharpening it. Now you can kind of edit DNGs. So I think I might change my workflow and start doing it a little bit earlier so that I can edit out backscatter a little bit earlier as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what's become really interesting with Topaz, which I forgot to show, was that you can actually select different parts of your images and only add sharpness to those parts as well.
Okay.
So that's really powerful too, because now you don't have that effect of backscatter being in that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
That's all. That's all. I'll leave you alone for now.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So my computer, as I mentioned, thankfully it happened now. My computer actually froze.
Sure.
So unfortunately, I won't be able to check any Facebook questions until I restart my computer. So I'll answer all of those in the comments. But I guess we can say our goodbyes now if there's nothing left. And I just want to say thanks everyone for watching, everyone who's out there. Hopefully you're still seeing this because my computer is frozen. So
thank you very much. Good
yeah.
to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks,
Yeah.
Mike, and I think I'll restart my computer.
All right. Have a good evening.
Right.
Take care.
Yeah, you
Thank
too.
you.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.